There's a photograph in the Willowbrook Historical Society that nobody likes to talk about. It was taken in 1952 on the edge of the old Marsh Road, and it shows 17 people standing in a perfect line, all facing the camera. Men, women, children. Their faces are blank. Not smiling, not frowning, just blank. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something wrong with their eyes. They're all looking just slightly to the left of the camera. All of them. As if they're watching something the photographer couldn't see. The society keeps it in a filing cabinet in the basement. Not on display. Not digitized, just filed away. Because in Willowbrook, Connecticut, there are some things you don't bring into the light. Some things you don't ask about. And some things you definitely don't put on the wall where tourists might see them. This is the story of what happened in Willowbrook between 1949 and 1956. It's a story about lights that appeared over the marshland, about families who stopped speaking to outsiders, about children who developed strange habits and adults who began writing in journals they never let anyone read. It's about a community that, for 7 years, lived under something they couldn't explain and couldn't escape. And it's about what happened when one family finally tried to leave. The official records say nothing unusual occurred in Willowbrook during those years. The census data is normal. The school records are intact. The property transfers look routine. But if you talk to the descendants, the ones who are willing to talk, you'll hear a different story. You'll hear about the things their grandparents saw, the rules their parents had to follow. The reason why, even today, nobody from Willowbrook goes near the eastern marsh after dark. This isn't folklore, this isn't legend. This is what happens when an entire community agrees to forget something together, when they bury the truth so deep that their own children grow up believing the silence is normal. But the evidence is still there, in attic boxes, in diary entries, in the margins of old newspapers where someone wrote notes they never meant to publish. And once you start looking, you can't unsee what Willowbrook tried so hard to hide. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The light started in March of 1949. A farmer named Edmund Marsh, no relation to the marshland, just an unfortunate coincidence, was checking his fence line just after sunset when he saw them. 3 pale orbs hovering about 15 feet above the water, perfectly still, glowing with what he later described as the color of old milk. He watched them for nearly 20 minutes. They didn't move, didn't flicker, just hung there in the twilight like lanterns suspended on invisible strings. Edmund told his wife that night. She told him not to mention it to anyone else. But he did. He told his brother-in-law, who told a man at the hardware store, who told his daughter, who taught at the elementary school. Within a week, half the town knew Edmund Marsh had seen lights over the eastern marsh. And within 2 weeks, 17 other people had seen them too. At first, it was treated like a curiosity, something strange but not necessarily threatening. People drove out to the Marsh Road in the evenings, parked their cars, and waited. Sometimes the lights appeared, sometimes they didn't. When they did show up, they always followed the same pattern: 3 lights, pale, motionless, always in a triangular formation, always about 15 feet above the water, and always, this is important, always watched by someone who would later say they felt compelled to keep staring, that they couldn't look away even when they wanted to. By summer, the sightings were happening almost nightly. But something else was happening too. The people who saw the light started changing, not physically, not in any way you could point to and say, there, that's different, but in small ways, behavioral ways. A man who'd been a talker his whole life suddenly became quiet. A woman who'd never missed Sunday service stopped going to church. Children stopped playing near the marsh, even during the day, without being told. And families who'd lived in Willowbrook for generations started locking their doors at night, something that had never been done before. The local newspaper ran exactly one story about the lights. It appeared on page 4 of the April 12th edition, under the headline, "Strange Phenomena Reported Near Marsh." The article was 3 paragraphs long, dry clinical. It mentioned Edmund Marsh by name, quoted him saying he'd seen unusual lights, and ended with a statement from the sheriff saying there was no cause for concern. That was it. No follow-up, no investigation. No interviews with the other witnesses, just 3 paragraphs, and then silence. But in the margins of that newspaper, in a copy preserved by a woman named Dorothy Carver, someone had written in pencil, "They don't want us to talk. They've already been to see us." Who they were, Dorothy never said. She kept that newspaper until she died in 1998, tucked inside her Bible, and her grandson found it when he was cleaning out her house. He scanned it, put it online, and that's how the story started coming back. By October of 1949, the people of Willowbrook had stopped talking about the lights to outsiders. Not because they'd stopped seeing them, but because something had made it very clear that silence was expected. There's no official record of what that something was, no police reports, no town hall meetings, no announcements in the paper. But the evidence exists in private letters, in diary entries, in conversations recorded decades later by family members who finally asked the right questions. A woman named Helen Pritchard wrote to her sister in Boston, November of 1949. The letter still exists. Her great-niece donated it to a digital archive in 2009. Helen describes a visit she received one evening from 3 men in dark suits who didn't give their names. They came to her door just after dinner. They were polite, calm. They asked her if she'd seen anything unusual near the marsh. She said yes. She'd seen the lights twice. They nodded. Then one of them said something that Helen wrote down word for word. Would appreciate it if you kept that experience private. For your family's sake. They didn't threaten her. Didn't raise their voices. They just smiled, thanked her for her time, and left. Helen wrote that she watched them walk to their car, a black sedan with no license plates, and that as they drove away, she noticed her hands were shaking. She never told anyone in Willowbrook about the visit. But she told her sister, and she added something at the end of the letter that her great-niece says still gives her chills. I don't know who they were, but they knew things about us, about our family, things they shouldn't have known. Other families reported similar visits, always 3 men, always polite, always the same message, keep it private. The visit stopped after a few months, but the message had been received. By early 1950, nobody in Willowbrook was talking about the lights to anyone outside the town, but inside the town, something else was happening. People were organizing, quietly, carefully. They were forming what one survivor would later call the Watchers. It wasn't an official group. There were no meetings, no membership lists, but there was an understanding. Certain families, those who lived closest to the marsh, those who'd seen the lights most often, took on the responsibility of monitoring them. Every night, someone would drive out to the Marsh Road and watch. They'd write down what they saw, the time the lights appeared, how long they stayed, any changes in behavior, and then they'd pass that information to the next family in the rotation. It was a surveillance system built out of fear and obligation, a way for the community to feel like they had some control over something they didn't understand. But the records they kept, the logs, the notes, the sketches, those documents tell a different story. They tell the story of a phenomenon that was becoming more active, more invasive, and by 1952, more interested in the people who were watching it. There's an entry from June of 1952 written by a man named Thomas Brennan. He was one of the watchers. He'd been monitoring the marsh for nearly 2 years. The entry, if brief, but it's been cited in every serious examination of the Willowbrook case since it surfaced. It says, "Tonight the lights moved. They came within 50 feet of my car. I could feel heat through the windshield. When I looked at them directly, I heard a sound, not through my ears, inside my head, like a voice but not words. Just presence. I left. I won't be going back." Thomas Brennan kept his word. He never went back to the marsh. But 3 weeks after he wrote that entry, his daughter, Caroline, who was 14 years old at the time, started sleepwalking. She'd get out of bed in the middle of the night, walk downstairs, and stand at the back door facing east, toward the marsh. Her mother would find her there, barefoot, staring through the glass, her breath fogging the window. When they'd wake her, she'd have no memory of it. This happened 11 times in 2 months. Then it stopped. Caroline is still alive. She's 87 now, living in a care facility in Vermont. In 2006, a researcher named Michael Hastings tracked her down and asked if she'd be willing to talk about Willowbrook. She agreed, but only under the condition that her current location wouldn't be disclosed. What she told him is one of the most disturbing testimonies in the entire case. She said that during those months when she was sleepwalking, she was having the same dream every night. She was standing at the edge of the marsh, and the lights were there, hovering just above the water. But in the dream, they weren't lights, they were eyes. 3 enormous eyes watching her, and she could feel them inside her mind, moving through her thoughts like hands flipping through a book. She said it felt like being read, like something was learning her. When Michael asked her what she thought the lights wanted, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think they were trying to see if we were ready for what she didn't know or wouldn't say." But Caroline wasn't the only child affected. Between 1950 and 1954, there were at least 9 documented cases of children in Willowbrook developing sudden behavioral changes, sleepwalking, night terrors, obsessive drawing always the same image over and over, 3 circles arranged in a triangle. Some of these children were taken to doctors in Hartford. The doctors found nothing physically wrong. They suggested stress, suggested the children were picking up on adult anxieties about the lights. But the parents knew better. They knew their children were being watched, and they knew that whatever was out there in the marsh was no longer content to just hover at a distance. By 1953, the Watchers had established a new rule. No one under the age of 16 was allowed near the Marsh Road after dark. Parents enforced it quietly but strictly. If you grew up in Willowbrook during those years, you didn't question it. You just knew. The marsh was off limits. But there was one family that tried to break the pattern. The Langfords. Daniel and Ruth Langford had lived in Willowbrook their entire lives. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. In the spring of 1954, Daniel told his brother that he was planning to move the family to Pennsylvania. He'd found work there, a fresh start. His brother asked why, and Daniel said something that was later repeated to a local historian in the 1980s. Because I don't want my children growing up in a place where something watches them sleep. The Langfords put their house on the market in June. They packed their belongings in July. They were scheduled to leave on August 9, 1954. On the night of August 7th, 2 days before the move, Ruth Langford called her sister in a panic. Her sister lived 3 towns over. Ruth was whispering into the phone. She said the lights had come to their property, not to the marsh, to their house. She said they were outside the children's windows, hovering. Watching, her sister told her to call the police. Ruth said she couldn't, that they'd been told not to. The call ended abruptly. The next morning, the Langfords were gone. When neighbors came by the Langford house on the morning of August 8th, the front door was unlocked. The car was still in the driveway. The packed boxes were stacked neatly in the living room, labeled and ready for transport. But the family was gone. All 5 of them. No note, no explanation, just absent. The police were called. A search was conducted. The marsh was combed. Dogs were brought in. Nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No clothing. No footprints leading away from the house. It was as if the Langfords had simply evaporated in the middle of preparing breakfast. There were eggs still in the pan on the stove, burned black. A coffee pot still warm. A child's shoe on the stairs, untied. And in the daughter's bedroom, on the wall above her bed, someone had drawn 3 circles in pencil, arranged in a triangle. The case was officially classified as a missing persons investigation. It stayed open for 7 years. Then it was quietly closed with no resolution. The house was sold in 1956 to a family from New York who knew nothing about what had happened there. They lived in it for 3 months before they broke their lease and left. They wouldn't say why, but a woman who helped them move out later said the wife had told her, "Something watches that house at night." From the marsh, we saw it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed? Would you have tried to leave? Or would you have become one of the Watchers, convinced that monitoring the phenomenon was the only way to survive it? After the Langfords disappeared, the town changed. There was no public panic, no hysteria, just a quiet, collective understanding that certain boundaries had been drawn and crossing them had consequences. Families stopped trying to leave. Property values dropped, but no one talked about why. The Watchers continued their rotations, but now there was an added layer of ritual. They began leaving objects at the edge of the marsh, small things, personal things, a wedding ring, a pocket watch, a child's toy. No one ever explained why this started or what it was meant to accomplish, but it became an unspoken expectation. If you were a Watcher, you left something behind, an offering, a tribute, a trade. In 1955, a journalist from Hartford visited Willowbrook to write a feature on small-town New England life. He stayed for 3 days. He interviewed shopkeepers, attended a church service, ate at the local diner. In his notes, later found in his archived files, he wrote, "Something is wrong here. Everyone is polite. Everyone smiles, but no one will talk about the eastern part of town. When I asked about the marsh, I was met with silence, not hostility, just silence. Like I'd asked about a family member who died and no one wanted to remember." The article was never published. The journalist died in a car accident 2 weeks after returning to Hartford. Single vehicle collision. He drove off the road late at night for no apparent reason. His editor, going through his files, found the notes about Willowbrook and decided not to pursue the story. Years later, that editor would tell his daughter, "I had a feeling, a bad feeling, like finishing that story would have been a mistake." The lights continued appearing until the winter of 1956. Then in January they stopped completely. No fade out, no gradual disappearance. One night they were there. The next night they weren't. The Watchers kept their vigil for another month, waiting for them to return. They didn't. By March, the rotations had ended. By summer, people had stopped talking about the lights altogether. It was as if the entire town had agreed, wordlessly, to move on. But you can't move on from something that's changed you. Not really. The people who'd been Watchers carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them kept journals. Private records they never showed anyone, hidden in attics and closets passed down to children who didn't know what they were reading until decades later. One of those journals belonged to a man named Arthur Henley. He'd been a watcher from 1951 to 1956. He died in 1989, and his grandson found the journal in 2003 while cleaning out Arthur's basement. It's a small leather-bound book, about 100 pages written in tight, meticulous handwriting. Most of it is observational, dates, times, descriptions of the lights. But toward the end, the entries become more personal, more confessional. In one entry from December of 1955, Arthur writes, "I understand now why we were chosen, not because of where we live, not because of the Marsh, but because we were the kind of people who would stay quiet, who would watch and not tell, who would sacrifice our own peace to keep something contained. We built our own prison, and we handed them the keys." That last line, "we handed them the keys," appears again in other journals from other watchers. It's almost like a shared realization, a collective guilt. The sense that by participating in the surveillance, by trying to manage the phenomenon instead of exposing it, they had somehow made themselves complicit. Another watcher, a woman named Iris Cobb, wrote in 1972, 16 years after the lights disappeared, "I still feel them sometimes. At night, when the house is quiet, I feel the weight of being watched. My daughter asked me once why I never opened the curtains after dark. I told her I liked my privacy. But the truth is I'm afraid of what might be looking back." Iris died in 1981. Her daughter Margaret read that journal entry at her funeral. She later said it was the first time she understood that her mother had been afraid her entire adult life, that the woman who'd seemed so strong, so composed, had been living under the shadow of something she could never explain. The children who grew up in Willowbrook during those years, the ones who are still alive, they remember it differently than their parents. They remember the rules, the curfews, the silence, but most of them didn't know why. A man named Robert Tice, who was 9 years old in 1953, said in an interview, "We knew not to go near the marsh. We knew not to ask questions about the lights, and we knew that some nights our parents would leave the house after we went to bed and wouldn't come back until morning. We never asked where they went. We just knew not to." That generational silence created something strange. A town full of people who'd inherited trauma they didn't fully understand, who followed rules they couldn't explain, who felt anxious near the marsh without knowing why. And when those children grew up and had children of their own, some of them left Willowbrook, but some of them stayed, and they passed down the same unspoken rules. Don't go to the marsh after dark. Don't talk about the lights. Don't draw attention. Even now, 70 years later, there are families in Willowbrook who still follow those rules. Not because they believe the lights will come back, but because their grandparents taught their parents, and their parents taught them, and breaking a rule that old feels like breaking something sacred or something protective. In 2011, a documentary crew tried to film a segment about Willowbrook for a series on unexplained phenomena. They contacted the Historical Society. They interviewed a few residents. But when they asked to film near the marsh, they were denied access by multiple property owners. When they asked why, they were told the land was private. When they pushed further, they were told the town didn't want the attention. The crew left after 2 days. In the footage they did capture, most of which was never aired, there's a moment where the producer is talking to an elderly man outside the general store. The producer asks him if he remembers the lights. The man looks directly at the camera and says, "I remember that talking about them didn't help anybody, and I remember that the people who left didn't make it far." Then he walks away. So what really happened in Willowbrook? What were the lights? Why did they appear for 7 years and then vanish without explanation? And what happened to the Langford family? There are no easy answers, no government files declassified, no deathbed confessions that solve the mystery, but there are patterns. And if you look closely enough at those patterns, something starts to emerge. Between 1949 and 1956, there were at least 12 other locations in the northeastern United States that reported similar phenomena. Lights over marshland or water, communities that went silent, families that disappeared. Most of these cases were never connected because they happened in isolated towns, in rural areas where local newspapers didn't syndicate their stories and where outside investigators weren't welcomed. But researchers like Michael Hastings and others who've spent years combing through archives have found them. A town in upstate New York, another in rural Maine, a third in western Massachusetts. All of them share the same elements: lights, silence, disappearances, and in each case, the phenomenon ended abruptly after several years, leaving behind a community that refused to speak about what had happened. Some researchers believe it was a government experiment, something involving surveillance technology or psychological conditioning. There were black set-ins, there were men in suits, there were implied threats. It fits the pattern of Cold War-era programs that we know existed, programs designed to test how communities respond to fear, to unknown stimuli, to prolonged observation. But there's no paper trail, no whistleblowers, no documents that tie Willowbrook to any known program. Others believe it was something else, something we don't have a framework for. They point to the physical effects, the way the lights seem to interact with individuals, the dreams, the sleepwalking, the sense of being read as Caroline Brennan described it. They argue that whatever was in the marsh was conducting its own form of study, learning, observing, and when it had learned enough it moved on. But here's what we know for certain. The Langford family was never found. Their case remains unsolved. In 1998, a hiker discovered a wedding ring near the eastern edge of the Willowbrook marsh, half buried in mud. The inscription inside read, "To Ruth with all my heart, Daniel." It was Daniel Langford's ring, the one he'd worn since 1941. It was tested, authenticated, and it was added to the evidence file, but no other trace of the family has ever been discovered. The town of Willowbrook still exists. It has about 1,200 residents now, smaller than it was in the 1950s, quieter. The marsh is still there, overgrown and dark, stretching out behind the old properties on the eastern edge of town. No one builds there, no one hikes there, and if you visit Willowbrook and ask about the lights, most people will tell you they don't know what you're talking about. But a few, the older ones, the ones whose parents or grandparents were watchers, they'll give you a look. A quiet, knowing look, and they'll tell you the same thing that man told the documentary crew. Talking about it didn't help anybody. The photograph from 1952, the one with 17 people standing in a line, all looking just to the left of the camera, it's still in the Historical Society basement. A researcher asked to see it in 2015. The curator brought it out, placed it on the table, and stood there while the researcher examined it. When the researcher asked if he could make a copy, the curator said no. When he asked why, she said, "Because some things should stay filed away." Before he left, the researcher asked her one more question. He asked if she believed the lights were real. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the photograph. Then she looked at him, and she said, "I grew up here. My grandmother was a watcher, and every night before I go to sleep I close my curtains. All of them, even the ones facing away from the marsh, because my grandmother told me that once something knows you've seen it, it never stops watching back." That's the legacy of Willowbrook. Not the lights themselves, not the disappearances, but the fear that remains, the rules that are still followed, the silence that's been passed down through generations like an inheritance no one wanted but everyone accepted. Because in Willowbrook, they learned something the rest of us haven't had to face yet, that some things don't need to be explained to be real, that some truths are too heavy to carry alone, so you bury them together, and that when something watches you long enough, you become part of what it's watching. The lights are gone, but Willowbrook is still looking over its shoulder, and maybe that's the real horror, not what happened, but what it turned them into. A town that learned to live with the unthinkable, and forgot how to live without it.